Hi, everyone. I am Angela Egan with Accelerated Learning, and I am so excited today to have Ben Powers here with us. He is a leading expert on dyslexia whose work bridges research, teaching, and on the ground practice. He is currently the executive director of the Southport School. He's also the founder and executive director of the Southport Collab. He is the president of the Dyslexia Foundation and the senior scientist at Haskins Laboratories. His roles also include director of the Yale UConn Haskins Global Literacy Hub and teaching and research positions at Yale School of Medicine and the University of Connecticut, where he continues to shape how educators, families, and schools support students with dyslexia. So I'm super excited to have you, Ben, because I know you are a wealth of knowledge around this topic, and I know this topic is not something that's new. However, I feel like as an educator, um, when you think of dyslexia, I feel like it's more at the forefront currently than it has been in previous years. And I feel like more students are being identified as having dyslexia. And so I want to just help educators and parents just better understand what dyslexia is and how they can best support their students and their children. So I'm going to start off by just having like a big picture. I ultimately want to take families like on a journey of from the start, what is dyslexia? When you're talking to families who are getting who get a dyslexia diagnosis, at first it can seem really overwhelming, kind of scary to hear that your child may have this. But what are the most important things that families and educators should know about dyslexia?
Great. Well, Angela, first of all, thank you so much for having me on today. And I think it couldn't be a better time to be talking about this topic, especially when we think about some of what's been in the news over the past couple of weeks. Because I think, unfortunately, one of the key misperceptions about dyslexia, and in fact, a lot of different types of learning disabilities, is that, the term disability, it's an important term because it connects us to community, it provides resources, it provides legal protections. So it's an important word. Unfortunately, there's also this perception that disability equals bad. And, there's this public perception that's risen in the press over some comments that were recently made that there's some relationship between dyslexia and IQ. And of course, that's not the case. Because you have dyslexia does not mean that you are impaired cognitively. There's no relationship there between intelligence and a learning disability like dyslexia. So I actually think that's one of the key things for everybody to understand in this conversation, but especially parents. We don't want to see something like an identification of dyslexia as some view of limitation because it's actually it shouldn't be viewed that way. The other good news about having an identification around dyslexia is that there's always something we can do with it. If we get our children or even adults in that journey in front of some really good evidence-based intervention and instruction, that's going to be super helpful. And so, as part of this, it's understanding that just because you're identified with dyslexia doesn't mean that that should limit or should stop anything. And in fact, there's lots we can do. So getting that identification is actually a critical first step in helping a child or an adult get that meaningful evidence-based instruction in front of them.
I think you were spot on there because as an educator, I know that, some of the first signs when students are in the younger grades, teachers start to notice maybe they're not progressing as quickly as some of their peers. And then when you bring up these concerns to parents, some parents are hesitant to go through with testing for kind of fear, kind of having that uncertainty of what may be next. And so that's definitely something that I do see as an educator. I think you were spot on too when you talked about the instruction. So, kind of piggybacking off of that, when you said identifying is really critical and making sure you identify earlier is better than later. But as an educator, I know sometimes kids spend years in MTSS and teachers don't really know, okay, at what point should this student be brought up for an evaluation, or at what point should a teacher say, hey, like this is something bigger than just needing a little extra support. Um, I think there's also around kindergarten, you do want to hold off At least that's what I've seen. We want to hold off kindergarten, first grade, but do you feel like it's more critical to try to address these things early on, or do you take a wait and see approach if you're not sure as an educator what to do?
Yeah, so, in my mind, information is power. And the more information we have, the more powerful we can be in understanding how we can respond and how we can help individuals. And, it's important to understand, dyslexia is a little bit tricky because we're talking about the brain and there's no simple test for dyslexia. To really get truly identified and diagnosed with dyslexia, a child or adult has to go through some fairly comprehensive testing. At the same time, there are some warning signs or identifiers that we can flag really early that tell us that whether or not that individual has dyslexia, if there are risk factors, we can take proactive measures because what we know from research is that earlier is better. And it's not just better incrementally, it's better exponentially. And what I mean by that is, and Dr. Nadine Gabb has talked a lot about this, that our model, our current model in the United States, unfortunately, is a wait to fail model. And so we wait on kids until they really start to struggle before we take that step to say, hey, should we do something? And part of that, to be fair, is because of a lack of resources or because of a lack of knowledge, and because the way the current system is set up is that a child has to kind of meet a threshold to be eligible for services. And what I think we really have the opportunity to do very early on, and we actually do a lot of this work here at the Southport School and the Southport CoLab, where we provide early reading screenings. We actually use a tool that can be used very early on so that even when a child is in pre-K and going into kindergarten, we can look for those early warning signs that tell us, hey, this might be a child who would benefit from some more prescriptive instruction now. And maybe that's a child who never actually has to be diagnosed with dyslexia because they've gotten really good evidence-based early instruction. So it's actually never too early to be looking for dyslexia or reading risk factors in a child.
So my next question would be, if you are administering a screening, you're talking about those look fors. What are some of those things to look out for? And then could you tell us a little bit more about the free screenings that you do offer at the Southport Collab?
Absolutely. So it's important for parents and educators to understand that a screening is not equal to identification. So it's just like getting screened for, like if you think of through a medical model, any kind of screening, it's just showing a risk factor. And it's the same for these early warning signs because some of the things that we look for, they may also be indicative of, something, a different type of learning or attention issue. But very early on, what we want to be looking for are things like, as an example, rhyming. If a child early on, like preschool age, is having trouble with rhyming or is having trouble with word retrieval, or is struggling with identifying and relating the letters of the alphabet to the sounds they make. There are some key indicators like that. Word retrieval is an important factor too, because one of the early indicators that we can use is called the RAN-RAS, which is a rapid automatized naming or rapid automatized symbols. And so what that test does is it presents to children who can't read or who don't have access to the printed word. It presents things like known familiar shapes and objects or colors. And so that way, what we want to measure is how fast, how quickly can that child retrieve the ability to name that object or that symbol. And so there are some really early signs, even before a child is really encountering truly the printed word, that we can start to see some of those things. One sign that a lot of parents or teachers tend to look for are reversals in with letters or in words. And while it's true that a child or an adult with dyslexia is likely to make more reversals than a reader who is not dyslexic. It's really common for most readers, especially in kindergarten first and even maybe into second grade, to make reversals. And that's because of the way that the reading circuit forms in the brain. It's really important for everybody to understand that reading is not a natural act. We were not born, our brains were not wired to read. And so, actually, because reading is a cultural invention, our brain actually has to rewire components to be able to learn to become a proficient reader. And that's actually why, as we're going through that process of our brain reorganization, that certain things like reversals happen, at those developmentally appropriate ages.
You were reading my mind because that is, I feel like, the go-to for educators. As a coach, that's often something that gets brought up to me. Well, hey, look at these reversals. Is there something else going on here? And that's where we then have a conversation like, okay, what else are you noticing? What else do you see? Because I feel like that is one of the most common things that I hear as a coach from teachers is, does this mean this student has dyslexia?
Right.
But as you
Yeah,
mentioned,
that's pretty common. Yeah, or I even hear that from adults saying, "Oh, I switch words sometimes, or I reverse words sometimes. I'm probably dyslexic." Or dyslexia means people read words backward. And the simplest way to explain dyslexia in my mind is that it's somebody who's it's a brain-based difference where accessing the printed word is more challenging. And again, it's because that brain circuitry really hasn't been wired in the same way as it has for a typically developing reader.
thank you for that. I want to get back into how to support that brain to help them rewire. But before I do, I wanted to continue on the topic of screeners and evaluations, because as you mentioned, you guys do offer a free screener through the Southport collab. However, if a parent hears from their teacher in their school that, they have some concerns and, but they're not really going to send them and have them evaluated yet, but brings up they're kind of watching that student. Should a parent seek a clinical evaluation? Should the parent do a wait and see if the school's not ready to go through with testing? Do you feel like that parent should seek support from an outside source, or should the parent wait and kind of go by the district's protocol of evaluating?
Yeah, so it's interesting. All of this, you talked about this at the beginning, Angela, that this is a journey. And so, again, in my mind, information is power. And the opportunity we have when a child is in school, when we're a parent, the opportunity we have certainly is to get information and input from the teachers or specialists who are working with our kids. At the same time, as the parent or the caregiver, we have the most amount of information on our child. And, I often hear from parents who say, "Oh my gosh, my gut was telling me something," or I have yet to meet the parent who said, "I acted too soon." it's
Yeah.
it's always the parent who's like, I wish I hadn't waited so long.
Yes.
Now, it's important to understand that when we're talking about something like dyslexia, we're really talking about the intersection of gene, brain, and environment. Genetics plays a key role. So if there's a genetic history here, if one of the parents it has dyslexia, there's close to a 1 in 2 chance that the child is likely to have dyslexia. So if there's any family history here, ding, 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 that's a huge
That's
indicator.
a red flag.
Um, and so the other piece of this is that's why something like screening can be really helpful. There's no harm in doing a screening. We actually use the instrument that Nadine Gabb and her team developed back at Boston Children's Hospital. It's been nationally validated. It used to be called the Early Bird Screener. It's now been purchased by somebody else, and so, but it's the same screener, and we use it here. And really, it's a tablet-based screener, and again, it walks the child through some of those really early indicators that we know are flags for potential reading difficulty. So getting a screener like that, that's a no-brainer. The thing parents have to be careful about is that a lot of what have been articulated as screeners for dyslexia or for literacy difficulty, a lot of them aren't as reliable as we would like them to be. Because not to go too deeply into it, but part of what happened is legislative mandates around the country started to mandate that children be screened, which is a great thing. And then all of a sudden, what happened is existing tools that schools had already been using, they tried to figure out how can we kind of back end this and try to figure out what are the indicators. So it's not to say that they're unreliable, but we use that screener that Nadine developed simply because it was built from the ground up and validated. It's statistically it's a reliable instrument, and that's why we use it. Beyond that, after the screening piece, if a child is really struggling in school and a parent is feeling like, hey, something is not matching up, the best thing you can do is ask questions and be that advocate. It's possible that the school can do testing. If a parent is feeling that there's something going wrong, ask those questions, request that testing, because legally, schools are obligated to do that for families, for parents, for caregivers, if there's a mismatch, in what's being seen. And in fact, the step after that, after getting testing, especially if a parent doesn't agree with it, parents also have the right to go out and get an independent educational evaluation. Now, there's a process to that. Don't just go out and do it, on your own if you're looking for like reimbursement, or a third party like the district to pay for that. But there is a process for that. And there are great resources like rightslaw.com, WRIGHTS law.com. Peter Wright argued the landmark Supreme Court case that helped get support for students who needed specialized programs for their dyslexia. And so he's got a great website with some real important information for parents navigating this process legally or with their school. But outside of that independent educational evaluation, advocating for that through the school, parents are also, you can go get your child tested. You can go out and find a tester to do that. What's really important, however, is that the person who is testing your child have experience and background with working with children or adults who have learning disabilities like dyslexia, because the testing itself is really important, but it's also knowing which tests to administer and what to be looking for in those tests.
Yeah, that was a lot of great information. I know personally, I've probably administered one of those tests that you talked about that a company created that flags for dyslexia, and I can tell you that it's very confusing,
Yeah,
because kids go on and they're clicking the buttons when they're not supposed to start, and you have to get in right before, and if they start too soon, it's for the rapid naming, and it can get a little bit messy. So you definitely want to make sure you find someone reputable, to make sure you have the right information. And then I think you were once again spot on with saying ask questions. I always say parents have power. And I think sometimes, from what I observe and see, that sometimes parents are afraid to ask those questions. Sometimes because they don't have the information, or they really just don't know what steps to be taking. But I'm a firm believer that parents have power and knowledge is power. And so hopefully that will allow them to make the right choices for their own children as well. And then just to stay on the testing part just for a few more seconds, when a school does an evaluation now, usually a student ends up being identified with a learning disability. They don't truly get identified as having dyslexia. Is that common pretty much in most places? Is it really hard to get a dyslexia diagnosis? Or if that student is shown to have a learning disability, do we just assume that's dyslexia? That's kind of a personal question I have too, because from what I've seen in the school setting is that usually there is that learning disability label, and then
that's right. That's
we're
right. It's
assuming
really
dyslexia.
tricky. This is so tricky. It's so tricky for everybody to navigate. When I think the easiest way to think about it if you're a parent or a caregiver, the easiest way to think about this from a school's perspective is that their job is not to diagnose. Their job through the testing is not to diagnose, the student. Their job is to help identify where the deficits might be, deficits that are significant enough that it falls outside of like the normative range for what they would expect to see in the classroom. And so, what they're doing with that is, through that testing and sitting down as part of, the PPT process. And it is important for parents or caregivers to know that they are an equal member on that team. That's really important for them to understand. As part of that, it's then classifying the child. What is the student? How are they being classified? Most commonly, like in Connecticut, they're classified in the SLD category, which is specific learning disability. If it's a child with ADHD, for example, they're likely going to get classified in the OHI, other health impairment category. The reason this is important is the distinction between being provided with an individualized education plan that's giving targeted and specific intervention with measurable goals and outcomes versus being provided with accommodations. Like an accommodation would be something like extended time or a distraction-free environment. So it's really important that the identification in that box that's checked is appropriate for what the student will need. To get an actual clear diagnosis, what's oftentimes the most helpful is to go out and get that independent educational evaluation or to get testing on your own that really gives that clear diagnosis. However, testing is expensive. And so, if you are a parent or caregiver and you get the district does testing and the testing is conclusive that it is some type of specific learning disability, it's pretty clear, especially if you can get some outside help, it's usually pretty clear whether it is dyslexia or not. And if there's any question on that, there's usually some additional tests that can be done that don't have to kind of duplicate the other testing that was done, that you can find like a literacy specialist or somebody who's got a background and deep experience in this area who can help really determine that dyslexia piece.
Okay, thank you for that. So now you've talked about instruction, the right type of instruction. So now we have a picture of what dyslexia is, what exactly, how we can get identified, the tools that are available. So now what happens next? So once you have this diagnosis, once you know that your student or your child um, needs intensive supports or more supports, what should that instruction look like?
Yeah, so this is a great question. There's a lot of conversation right now about the science of reading and what instruction looks like. And what's important to understand is that no matter the severity of the dyslexia or the reading difficulty, every child, every reading brain needs the same components to develop. And so what's really important to understand is that the instructional model should be backed by what research tells us are the important building blocks of the reading brain. And so then it becomes a matter of dosage. And what I mean by dosage is how much intervention, how much direct instruction does that child who's struggling need to be able to develop the requisite skills. And part of the reason that dyslexia is so challenging to diagnose is because when we look at an individual child's profile, there are going to be relative areas of strength and there are going to be relative areas of deficit. And so it's really teasing apart, and understanding it with that individual child. Where do they need more of that dosage or that emphasis as they're going through that instructional program? And so there are some great, research-based and evidence-based instructional programs or curricula out there that can be implemented. There are also people who are really well trained in this space who don't use a set program but use an approach like the Orton-Gillingham approach. And so, I was trained in the Orton-Gillingham approach very early, but somebody who's trained in the Orton-Gillingham approach really has a deep understanding of where an ability to look at where is a child struggling as they're going through the reading process, what areas really need to be targeted, and how to really do that spiral of making sure that we're giving the appropriate dosage in the area, whether that's phonemic awareness, phonics, the aspects of orthography, semantics, syntax, morphology, because ultimately, we need all these components to get to a place of comprehension. And that's the real goal of reading, is understanding what the printed word in front of us is trying to relay.
Yeah, thank you for that information. You talked about the Orton-Gillingham approach, and that is kind of like has been the gold standard for a very long time with supporting students with dyslexia. I know as a parent, it can be confusing knowing what type of instruction your child is receiving. So, what type of questions should parents ask at their PPTs or ask their teachers to figure out if their child is receiving this right type of instruction? I know personally as a coach, sometimes we have students who get referred to MTSS, and then we kind of do a deep analysis and kind of look at the instruction. We look at a lot of different things that are happening in the classroom, their personal history, and sometimes we notice that maybe they're not receiving the right type of targeted instruction in the classroom. And so I think sometimes that then puts off us referring to that student, having that student then go to an evaluation because they're not receiving the right type of instruction. So how can you make sure that your child's getting that right type of instruction?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what's important to understand is, for a parent or caregiver in that process, is to really, one of the questions that's important to ask is, where is my child struggling? Why is this program or approach the right fit for where they are and what their needs are? So I think that's a really important question to ask. Another important question to ask is, who is delivering the instruction? Are they trained in this? What's their background and experience in this? Because a lot of times, unfortunately, what can happen with programs is that, published programs are readily available. And so anybody could take a published program and sit down with a kid, a child, a student, and, go through it. It doesn't mean it won't be helpful, but, it's important that the individual, if they're delivering a program, has been trained in it. Likewise, with an approach like Orton-Gillingham, unfortunately, there are people out there who have had, just a few hours of something like, Orton-Gillingham training, where you need far more than that to be an effective Orton-Gillingham practitioner. And so, it's really important to understand, has the person been trained? Do they have experience delivering this? And do they have experience delivering this, to this age range of child? And then the other piece that's important is understanding, how is the instruction being delivered? How many days a week, how many hours, but also, is this one-to-one? Is this in small group? And if it's in small group, are the other students that the child is, or the students being grouped with, you know, are they needing the same kind of targeted instruction? Because sometimes what I have found is that, because of scheduling demands, several students will be grouped together, being very different, have very different instructional needs.
Yes.
And then what ends up happening is, that, let's say that's a 45-minute block, maybe if there are 3 or 4 kids in there, maybe 5 or 10 minutes is being spent on your child in the area of emphasis they need. And then they might be working very much independently while the interventionist is going to a different student who has different needs. So it's really understanding, what the program or the approach is, who's delivering it, and how it is being delivered.
I think too, then that connects to I know a lot of families seek tutors. And so
Mhm.
currently they're looking for tutors who have that follow that Orton Gillingham approach or are Wilson trained. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with Ebley, but I know that's been a hot topic lately of parents seeking Ebley tutors. So aside from I know as an educator personally, just because someone's trained doesn't mean they may be the best fit for your child, or they may not have the knowledge, even though they have been trained. Does that kind of make sense? So there's
Yeah.
a lot of people who may have been trained in a program, but yet their delivery, their implementation of it may not be very targeted, or their pacing may be off. So, what are key things parents should look for? I know you already mentioned a lot of that, right? Having trained, they have the right approach. But like, is there anything else parents should ask if they're seeking outside supports like a tutor to work with their child?
Yeah, so these are great questions. I think, at the end of the day, and it's funny, I started my career working with kids with dyslexia as an Orton Gillingham tutor, tutoring one-on-one. And actually, I was really fortunate. My mentor was one of the founding members of the academy, a woman named Diana Hanbury King, who passed away a few years ago. But she founded the school that I got trained at. She was my mentor, and so I had that experience early on. And what I will share about the tutoring piece is that it's like any other relationship. It's a relationship. And so, yes, the match is really important. Having that match is really important. And so, understanding how that tutor works with kids, getting a sense of that interaction, and trying a session. I mean, we certainly don't want to give up like after one session, but I
Yes.
think, it's like any other relationship. It's making sure that the child feels comfortable, that the interaction is positive, and that's going to be, somebody the child sees as being on their team or, helping them grow. The other thing I will say is it is really important to understand, that this person has been, in fact, trained by a credible accrediting body. So, one of the things I have encouraged parents to do in the past is to go directly to the places that certify or accredit these individuals. Like, if you are interested in hiring a Wilson tutor, that you're validating that person has in fact been trained by Wilson, or, in the case of like the Orton Gillingham approach, directing you to the Orton Gillingham Academy. They have a list of, all their individuals who have been trained and are, accredited by them. One thing I will flag is that, certainly the credential that the individual has, that is an important factor. At the same time, I wouldn't always discount or I wouldn't correlate necessarily somebody's certification level with their ability to deliver instruction. And I'll use myself as an example. I'm certified at the associate level in the academy. I've been doing this work now for 27 years. And so, I've actually met all the requirements to apply for certified status. But over the years, I've just, life is what it is. And so,
Yes.
just because somebody doesn't have the exact credential or qualification level you're looking for within that accrediting body, I wouldn't automatically discount that person. I would understand what's their background, what's their training, what's their experience. It's what's most important is that they've had enough training, enough experience, enough exposure, and that they're acknowledged by an accrediting body as having met the standards that are important to be able to earn either membership or credential status within that organization.
That was really great information. Thank you for that because I feel like sometimes we get so hyper focused on looking for a specific certification or program, but I think that relationship key is really important. And I know many people do offer free sessions, so just find someone that's the best fit for your child is really key.
That's right. Very key.
I just have one or two more questions.
Sure, please.
Just thinking of districts who are trying to move towards more evidence-based literacy practices. What have you learned at the Southport School? Obviously, you have a very knowledgeable staff. You guys are very highly recognized. What is something that teachers should try to implement, or what's one change that would be easy for teachers to implement to kind of start shifting their mindset more towards the science of reading and evidence-based practices?
Yeah, so I think, what's interesting about that question, Angela, is that unfortunately, so many of our teacher preparation programs have such a limited focus on literacy. And so, a lot of teachers come into this field really having to learn on the ground. And so, I think, teachers, what I suggest to teachers is, I think, unfortunately, teachers get a bad rap a lot of the time, where a lot of blame is laid at their feet that is not deserved. They're walking into an environment where, they have to rely on the training and teaching that they've received, and then also whatever resources or materials are in their district, especially in a state like Connecticut that's locally controlled, where whatever curriculum decisions have been made in that district, that is what the teacher is being asked to use or to deliver. What I think is helpful sometimes for teachers to understand is that you know, this whole debate between like the science of reading or,
Yes.
programs that have been so popular in the past, like Readers and Writers Workshop. What's important to understand is it's not an all or nothing conversation. And we want to be careful that we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Because there are really, it's really important that we validate, the different components to effective reading instruction. And so, like phonics, as an example, phonics gets a lot of attention. Phonics is
Gets
important,
all the attention.
right? But there's a reason for that, right? There's a reason phonics gets so much attention. One is because it's really tangible for us. And of course, we cannot access the printed word unless we know how to decode the letters. So, that makes sense. But the other thing behind phonics is that phonics, when we look at like the big five of reading, when we look at, those pillars, phonics is the one that is most teachable. It's the
Yes.
one that is most easily packaged in a
Yes.
curriculum or program to deliver. So, it's something, it's like literally something like we can touch, right? It's something that's teachable. It's something that programmatically is easier to package. Now take comprehension. Comprehension is much more complicated because comprehension relies, for any people who have seen Scarborough's reading rope, it requires a lot of different components, right, to weave together to be able to understand, its background knowledge, vocabulary, right? Yes, phonics, the ability to decode the words on the page. So there, unfortunately, a lot of emphasis gets placed on phonics. Again, phonics is important, but we also have to move beyond that. And so
Yes.
some of what I would suggest to teachers beyond phonics is trying something else within the umbrella of the science of reading. One thing that I have recommended a lot is trying something in the space of morphology. The understanding how word parts interact. And I won't go too deeply into it, but
Yep.
there's inflectional morphology and there's derivational morphology. And inflectional morphology, the easy way to think about inflectional morphology is how it changes a word from, like as an example, from present to past tense. So ed, the suffix ed, that's inflectional morphology. It takes us from like, I want this bike to I wanted the bike, right? Versus derivational morphology, which helps us understand the meaning, the deeper meaning behind the word. So, like in the case of the prefix D, like D means to go down. So, like if we see the word descend, it means, at least we know it means something to go down. So, what I would encourage teachers to do is try something underneath that umbrella of what we consider the science of reading. Some of those pillars underneath the science of reading, like morphology, because what I find in that is that it actually opens up a big door for teachers in terms of their own professional learning and interest, and also something that really can hook students into that conversation. And what's ironic is, one of the reasons I love morphology is that for a lot of kids who learn morphology, a lot of adults haven't learned morphology. So all of a sudden, they're the person at the dinner table who knows that D means down or that cap means head. And so if we decapitate somebody, we're literally bringing their head down, right? A lot of adults wouldn't necessarily know that. So,
I agree.
it's teaching to interest, and it's also understanding that the science of reading isn't about boring kids or being a boring teacher. It's about the discovery of language and how we can link components of language together to help everybody understand the written word.
You're absolutely right. And that's something that I've had a lot of conversations with some teachers in the upper grades. We've kind of talked about that because I try to stress that phonics is once your students have that basic code, beyond that, we need to expose them, like you said, to morphology, to word origins, because through morphology, we're teaching them meaningful parts of words. We're enhancing their vocabulary. We're supporting them with comprehension at the word level, and you kind of integrate a lot of those same structures and routines that you do with phonics, but on a deeper level. And I feel like so often it's like, oh, this child is reading. We kind of just stop once they have the basic code, but beyond that, we need to go a little bit deeper. At least I feel as an educator, that's something that should be happening in the upper elementary grades, and definitely as we move towards middle school. Because personally, I know I never received instruction on that, but I think it would have been nice to have that knowledge in my elementary years.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a great acronym that Marianne Wolf uses a lot, and actually Reed Lyon, who used to be at the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development at ICHD, it's called POSSUM. It's phonology, orthography, syntax, semantics, lowercase u for understanding, and morphology. And I reference that because it's a great tool, I think, to remind all of us that beyond the five pillars that get talked about a lot, it goes a little bit more deeply into that, and just is an important reminder that there are a lot of components to being an effective reader, to getting to that lowercase u, which is actually really the end goal, right? Comprehension.
Yes.
So
Yep. That was great. Thank you for all of that. I do want to mention that the Southport Collab does offer professional learning opportunities for educators. There are several programs that can be taken online. I personally attended a webinar on executive functioning skills, and I thought it was amazing. I thought that it was very well presented, and I received so much new information from it that I started implementing, just thinking about games, activities that you can incorporate on Fun Fridays to support students with executive functioning skills. I feel like that's a whole other topic of conversation. But if you are an educator or a parent and you're looking to support your students, definitely check out the Southport Collab because they have tons of opportunities and different programs to help build your knowledge around dyslexia and learning to read in general. So Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to build our knowledge around this topic. If you could just say one thing to the parent of a child with dyslexia to kind of ease their mind and to help them feel a little bit more in power as they walk away from this webinar, what's something you would just say to them to make them feel a little bit better about receiving that information?
absolutely. It's funny. I think that's one of the most rewarding parts of this work is that, the identification is just the beginning of what will be an incredible journey. And any incredible journey is going to have moments of, frustration and despair and difficult pathways, but also incredible moments of self-reflection and discovery and success. And there are millions and millions of individuals around the world, tens of millions, who have dyslexia and who are just achieving incredible things in their life. And again, I'll go back to that notion that knowledge is power. And so this identification of dyslexia, all that means is we have yet another piece of knowledge to build on to help our children be successful in school, in life, and beyond. So,
Thank you so much. I love that. Knowledge is power. So thank you so much, friend, for joining us today. I really appreciate it.